to turn the world topsy-turvy. It means that a group of people, namely the Chamorro people, are going to determine what is going to be the relationship with the United States. Now let's just give a scenario. If it goes through statehood, then nothing will happen. It will be status quo. We will continue on as usual because the agreement was between the United States and the freely associated states of Micronesia, of which now Guam is a state of the United States. So nothing will happen. It will stay the same. It'll be the same as Hawaii. If we were to go through independence or free association, what would happen is now the people who want to call Guam home, there's going to be Chamorros that will leave who will not want to be part of an independent or freely associated Guam. There will be people from the outside who want to become a part of this new society. It is those people that will get together. It is those people that will get together to determine a constitution on what our laws would look like. It wouldn't just be only the Chamorro people at that point. The Chamorro people's desire to determine what the relationship with the United States will be affected. But after that, it's up to the people of Guam, all the people of Guam who wish to call this new place home, to determine how we're going to deal with our neighbors, with other countries, whatever treaties we have in place.
And so, yeah, to that point, it's an important sort of thing. It's one reason that we don't often think about, but as I think about sort of, if I want to buy a house, right, in this market right now, political status affects whether or not I can afford to buy a house. Because unlike an independent country in which you can determine, for example, that your local labor force is not sufficient to meet the demands, if you live in a territory, your foreign labor needs, all those sorts of things are decided by somebody thousands of miles away who may not care about whether or not you can afford a house, but maybe thinking that they want to make an example of Guam. Or for national security issues, they think that they need to cut off these types of workers because they might pose a national security threat. So whatever your needs and interests are, they don't factor into the people that make those decisions over in Washington, D.C. And it's the same then in terms of sort of agreements between nations and the United States, is that if we were independent or freely associated, then you could still have an agreement, and you likely would have an agreement with the freely associated nations, but it would be something that they would decide. And it would be something which would be determined here in terms of the needs of the community, rather than something which was signed off on by a bunch of people, the other side of the world, and then we kind of hope that they will reimburse us, and we hope that they will comply, that they will respect sort of what they have promised in that agreement. And so part of the reason why decolonization is important is because we are on the other side of the world from the United States. But the people who make the decisions about the basic sort of infrastructure of our lives are people who have largely never been to Guam, who actually don't know anything about Guam, who don't care about Guam. They are the ones that get to decide those larger issues that surround the island. And I don't like that. I don't think that that's the way it should be. I don't think that somebody who sits sort of in the Department of Interior or the Pentagon on the other side of the world gets to look at a map and decide whether or not it's easy for me to buy a house this year. That's what I think.
U.S. immigration is actually one of the benefits of even becoming a state is not available. As you watch, this president, that how he controls the immigration, especially in the Mexico border. Okay, so, however, as a state, we can influence some of those immigration policies, because again, we'll have a voice in Congress. So that way, but the borders of all states, including Hawaii and Alaska, are still controlled by the U.S. immigration. And like I said in my presentation, that having a voice in Congress would at least we can exert some influence that way.
Thank you for that. Okay, I would like to pose another question by the audience. Somehow, many fear that we cannot survive without the U.S. and want status quo. What can you do to alleviate that fear?
Let's see. Well, there's lots of ways. I mean, there's lots of ways. Number one, you can look at a map of the Pacific. In my presentation, I mentioned FESPAC. And that was an important moment where we got to see the Pacific through very different eyes. I think normally people on Guam and Chamorros historically think about other islanders as being less than us because they're less modern. They're less quote-unquote Americanized or civilized. But I think that FESPAC in 2016 was an important moment when we could see that, that other places have kept their culture, but they've also advanced. They're also progressing and moving in ways that Guam isn't. And so we can look for those people that are afraid of independence. I mean, the overwhelming majority of the people in the world live in independent countries. Do you see them having psychic sort of identity crises where they're freaking out all the time because we're an independent country and it's the scariest thing in the world? No. Independence is normal. Independence is natural. Guam is abnormal. And in fact, when we make the connections, if we make the connections to any of the three statuses that are here, we can see that our lives would be better served if we had a higher level of sovereignty. Whether, as Senor Harris said, whether we could fight it out as an equal member in the United States government, where we would have senators who would have a voice alongside other senators, and we wouldn't just be screaming into the Marianas Trench, which by the way isn't ours. Or free association, in which our relationship with the United States would be outlined by a treaty, a compact, an agreement, which they have to follow, even if they don't like to follow. Or independence, in which we would get to still have a relationship with the United States if we wanted to, but also seek partnerships and real working relationships with our neighbors. We sit on the edge of Asia and we are not allowed to have formal relationships with anybody around us. We have consulates here, we have embassies here. They are for the United States. They are for the United States. They are not here for us, and we can pretend that they're here for us, but they're here for America. We can't make a deal with any country around us about any substantive thing. And so anything here would bring us to a point where a lot of these issues that we face today, we can actually make changes to improve them. But as a territory, number one, you lack the ability to change the structure of your life. And number two, it also fosters a dependency where many people here feel like we don't have to improve things because America is always going to have some money or always going to give us something to take care of. And so we don't develop that sense of self-reliance. We don't develop that sense of dignity because we're stuck in this place where we are the weird colony in the world. Everybody else is moving on, and we somehow still feel special that we are a colony.
You know, the one thing that we all have in common here is that we're all US citizens. And looking at it from that point of view, being a territory should be abhorrent. Because one of the fundamental principles of governance in the United States is that a government governs by consent of the governed. And we don't have that. Tomorrow, if Congress wanted to, it could strip this or that law or right from the people of Guam because we live in an unincorporated territory. And so, just looking at it from that level, we as Americans should be disgusted that we are not represented, should be offended that we cannot participate in the larger democracy because it's just simply plain old un-American. It's un-American and it's unacceptable.
And actually, in direct answer to that question, to alleviate the fear, Palau is a perfect example of an independent country that is freely associated not just with the United States, but it actually has affiliated with the government of Japan. And that's why the Japanese government rebuilt the Palau Bridge, which cost about 21 million just for being a good neighbor. And if you notice that the Northern Marianas, Saipan specifically, lost most of the Japanese tourists who actually since is more or less now coming through Palau because of that freely association with, and Palau is not only freely associated with the United States for many things, and that's why there's still military places in Palau, and also they still get the defense from the US military, but also now they're freely associated with Japan, mostly economically. So those are examples of, that one can be independent and doesn't necessarily really have to fear some of the unknowns.
Thank you very much for sharing. This will be our last question for this portion. We thank you everyone for submitting your questions. Unfortunately, we will not be able to get to all due to the amount of questions, but we are grateful for the participation. So the final question is, do you think Guam should go through the UN process similar to the route taken by the Trust Territories?
So one of the things that makes Guam's path different is that the Trust Territories were in the UN system, but they were under the Security Council of the United Nations. The Security Council had purview over it, and that meant that it had a higher status within the within the UN, and the Security Council is sort of the most powerful part of the UN infrastructure. And they were also seeking decolonization at a time when the US was more concerned with alliances and with its sort of, with its profile internationally, the Cold War. And so Micronesian leaders, the generation of Micronesian leaders, they did very well to negotiate, to push. They did get some things out of the United States that the United States did not want to give up. But they used the system to sort of achieve it. Guam, unfortunately, is under the Fourth Committee of the United Nations, which is much less powerful. And so that means then that the UN itself, the Fourth Committee, if you may or may not know, every 10 years they have their International Decade for the Eradication of Colonialism. And it's the end of the third decade of eradicating colonialism from the world, but the Fourth Committee can't really get any movement on it because either the administering powers don't want to engage. So for example, people go regularly to the UN from Guam. The US doesn't show up. And the US usually refuses to formally talk to anybody from Guam because it would be an acknowledgement that they recognize that you have the right to decolonize, and they don't like to acknowledge that Guam has any rights that they don't give to Guam. And so that's part of the problem there. Now, but we can work with those around us to help elevate our profile in the international system, because that's part of the problem. What's it called? When people from Guam go out into the world, people think of Guam as just America. They either don't know what Guam is, they think it's Guatemala or somewhere in Africa, or they think it's just an American military base. And that's a problem. Because if you want to go to a climate change conference and talk about Guam's needs, you can't speak on behalf of Guam because the American flag flies here and you aren't allowed to have your own voice. America speaks for you, And if they don't say anything about you, that sucks, but that's life in a colony. You can't go to Pacific government forums and work with other leaders. You can as an observer sometimes. You can watch and you can talk to them, but formally you're not allowed to sit beside other independent countries in the Pacific. And so, so part of what we need to do is just keep reminding people in the US and elsewhere that Guam's decolonization is something, it's a problem that the world needs to solve. It's a problem that needs to be fixed. So I always tell political leaders, when you go to Washington, D.C., when you meet with federal officials, you don't have to be Angel Santos. You don't have to jump a fence to get their attention. Just always remind them that we are a territory and that we are pushing for decolonization. And it should be a part of all discussions. When Joe Ada was Magalahi and they were pushing for Commonwealth, one of the things that they did is that they changed the letterhead for the government of Guam so that it said Commonwealth Now. So that everything the government put out and everything it sent to the federal government reminded them, this is your obligation. This is what we're pushing for. And there was some successes at that time. And we should keep that in mind. If we tell everybody that we're just proud to be where America's Day begins and we just love everything the way it is, then if you ask for help, they're gonna look at you and say, we thought you were happy. We thought you loved the American flag. We thought you loved everything the way it is. We don't hear any complaints from you. We don't hear any problems. So that's what I would recommend is the more that we can get used to telling our story in a way that Guam's decolonization is an essential part of where we're going next, the easier it'll be.
Actually, that's why I started my presentation all the way back to the Spanish-American War. And at the conclusion of the Spanish-American War, the Treaty of Paris, unfortunately, that was signed by the United States, the Treaty of Paris gave the United States the right to determine our future political status. And the United States, unfortunately, has not followed that mandate, because the Treaty of Paris clearly stated that the governing country, which is the United States, is supposed to help Guam. Okay, is supposed to help Guam achieve that decolonization status. But unfortunately, the United States has not lived up to that mandate, and I honestly don't believe, as he mentioned, because of our status in the United Nations, I don't think going through the United Nations really make a big deal of difference, especially to President Trump, because he just, and this is why during the last voting, Nikki Haley, I believe, was the ambassador that actually voted against Guam's decolonization effort. So, there you are, the governing, country who's supposed to be helping us decolonize is the one that's actually against us decolonizing. So this is, to me personally, even though we have a non-voting delegate, I believe that is one of the area that our delegate really should start bringing this up to the United States Congress, that it is their duty to listen and give Guam its opportunity to decolonize. And it's unfortunate, we even had a Undersecretary of Interior, but I never heard anything from the delegate's office, nor from the Undersecretary of Interior that really has, should have more clout in the United States. We never really fought that issue. And I believe that now we should educate our leaders from the governor on up to, our delegate to start fighting for that right that we actually have that the United States has signed that they will assist us at sea.
You know, a fun fact was I got to look into some archival material, and I saw newspapers when the Treaty of Paris was signed. And most people don't know this, but the Spanish government actually lodged an official protest when they signed the Treaty of Paris because of the clause that it did not allow for the political maturation of the former colonies, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And so here it was, our colonizer of 300 and something odd years, protesting at the fact that they were handing over this colony and that the United States had no clear legal way forward of how they were going to rectify the citizenship issue with these peoples. And that's just something to make you pause and think about, is from the get-go, from the conception of Guam as part of the American framework, already our rights were being disputed. And so always remember that whenever we deal with the United States, that from the beginning, it had it out for us.
Thank you all.
Sejus Masin, Toro Samsun, Finato Mizu.
Thank you guys very much. That's going to complete the question and answer segment. We're going to go ahead and take a break, and we'll reconvene at 11:20. When we come back from the break, we'll have our keynote speaker, Dr. Encito Walter.